Okay, now.
Go.
Welcome, everybody, to this lecture on the great American artist, Man Ray. Thank you to Kehilat Hanahar, Little Shul on the River, for hosting this as part of a series of American modernism and the disproportionate Jewish influence on it. And a special thanks to Abraham for guiding the adult ed, and to Jerry, managing this broadcast, and to Sharon for laboring to put together these 90 or so slides. Man Ray was arguably the greatest American artist of the avant-garde. He was a painter, an assembler, a collagist, a photographer, and a filmmaker. He was an innovator. He had a career of restless investigation of new ideas, new techniques, as much as anybody before or since. Part of the energy and the inspiration came from his lifelong friendship with Marcel Duchamp, which we'll talk about, but they were brothers for nearly 60 years until the night that Duchamp died, and Man Ray and his wife were with them. So next.
I have to start sharing. Okay, can you see that?
Good, Jerry.
All right, that by the way is a solarized portrait of Man Ray, self-portrait, and we'll talk about solarization later, but that's self-portrait. And that was in, let's see, what year was it? 1932. Okay, next. That's the portrait itself, very iconic portrait of Man Ray. His camera facing out, oddly enough. Next. So Man Ray was born in Philadelphia. His name was Emanuel Radnitsky. His father, Melach, who became Max. His mother, Manya, who was Minnie. So it was Max and Minnie Ray. His father was a tailor from Kiev, and his mother was from Minsk. They changed their name, and apparently it was his brother's inspiration to change it from Radnitsky to Ray. And so then you had Max and Minnie, and Emmanuel, who was called Manny, became Man. So he became Man Ray. They moved from Philadelphia in the first few years of his life. And as we'll see through the course of this, they were Yiddish speaking, they were immigrants, but Man Ray did his best to obscure his Jewish origins. And he even claimed that the inspiration for Man Ray came from his father in the hospital, who wrote down Man for his name, which was total fiction. But it does go to the point that he wanted to move away from Emanuel Radnitsky. Next. He went, next, Jerry? Yeah, nope, back up one. He went to Boys High. He mastered in mechanical drawings. This is one of the earliest examples in 1907. Next. As well as on the left, ornamental lettering, other mechanical drawings. He became expert, and it led him into his only working career other than as an artist, first in advertising and then in map making, both of which he was able to use this expertise that he gained at an early age. On the right is a patchwork cloth quilt that he did, wall size, that he used scraps from his father and tailoring and his mother's seamstressing. And he was to repeat this over the course of his career as a painter, always referring back in his work to this tailoring background that he had through his parents. Next. Nope. Yeah. So he was, after high school, he was still living at home. He had clearly staked his future on his life as an artist, and he was great at mechanical drawing. But what he really wanted to do was draw naked women. And he got his chance at the Ferrer Center in New York, where he had plenty of opportunities. He was so enthusiastic that he kept trying to invite the models back to his house in Brooklyn with his parents so that they could pose for him and some of his fellow artists, none of whom took him up on the offer. Next. One of the great influences on Man Ray early and continuing through his career was Alfred Stieglitz, who was one of the great American photographers and very much a modernist himself, who with Edward Steichen had the famous Gallery 291, which is portrayed on the left. And it was principally for their photography, but they augmented it by bringing in modern art, which was really a new idea from Europe. And they showed all of the, Picasso and Braque and Brancusi and Magritte in this studio. And we know that Man Ray in 1910 was in the studio looking at a Rodin exhibition, 1911, a Cezanne exhibition, and in 1912, an exhibition featuring Matisse, Picasso, and Braque. So he was getting a heavy immersion in modern art, and he was learning at the foot of Stieglitz. And one of the things that he realized was that photography could be incredibly important for him to take pictures of his own work. He wanted to make sure that his art was represented as best it could be, and decided he would be the photographer. But Stieglitz showed him more than that. He showed him not only how to photograph his own work, but he showed him how photography could document conceptual art. And even more than that, with lighting and various effects, it could itself create works of art, not just representational, not just portrait. And even with those, with the use of techniques that he started to learn and went on to develop himself, he could create works of art. Next. So in 1913, he's 23 years old. This is a painting that he did of Stieglitz, which I
Impressive.
marvelous. And Stieglitz, in turn, this is the photograph he did of Man Ray, and they exchanged these. And that is the young Man Ray, 23 years old. Next.
Wow. Handsome.
So in 1914, the end of 1913, he moves to Ridgefield, New Jersey, finally out of his house in Brooklyn into his own cottage that he shared with a couple of other artists. It was an incipient artist colony. This is a self-portrait that he did in 1914, which again, I think is terrific. Next. And so in this early life as an artist, this is the earliest still life that we could find, and it's called the Black Vase. The Black Vase belonged to the guy that brought him to the cottage, and by the time this was completed, they were no longer friends, and he was kind of pissed that Man Ray used his Black Vase for a still life, but that is the Black Vase. Next. This is a painting that Man Ray did shortly after he arrived in Ridgefield. He met this woman, Adon Lacroix, also known as Donna Lacour. She was then married to one of the guys that he met at the Ferrer Center, but they were on the outs. She arrived with her soon-to-be former husband, Man Ray, and Donna fell for each other, and they got married a year later. She moves in, and this painting is the first painting that Man Ray sells, and it was sold to a patron of Stieglitz. Stieglitz loved the piece and arranged for it to be the conduit for its sale. So that is Man Ray's first sale. Next. Over the course of the 3 years that he is in New Jersey, he painted almost every day, and there are dozens of pieces that he did. These I thought were too interesting. The first left, I don't really understand the significance of its title, ADMCMX5, but it is an example of the Leger, Braque, Picasso influence that he was playing with, and he would have many variations of this. On the right is a watercolor he did, which is clearly a nod to Cezanne, among others. So here he's really working his talents as a painter. And it's worth mentioning, he wanted his whole life to be known as a painter. He was a superb painter, certainly by the end of his career. And he was chagrined that by the end of his career, he was known more as a photographer, and even more than that, as a portrait photographer. It just bothered him to his last day. He wanted to be known as a painter and as an artist, a conceptual artist. Next. This is his wife, Donna, and this is a book of her poetry that he designed and published in New Jersey in 1915. And they printed 20 of these, and Stieglitz bought 3 of them to give to friends, always trying to promote Man Ray. But here Man Ray is the designer and publisher for Donna. And Donna and Man Ray split around 1919. We'll come to that, but suffice it to say, I'll get ahead of the story, that they went to a restaurant in New York where they moved in 1916. And one of the waiters passed her a note that he wanted to have a chance to meet her separately. She told Man Ray that she thought she might like to do that. He wasn't very happy. She did it. She came back, and then she met him again. She came back, and the third time she wanted to leave and meet this waiter was the end of their marriage. But that is Donna LaCroix, Don LaCroix. Next. He's still cultivating his modernist chops. And again, we can see the influences of the Braques and Picassos and Leger here. These are assembled forms, and he loved assembling objects, which we're going to see later, which he did his whole career, and then photographing them. And in time, the photographs became more important to him than the objects. And in many cases, the objects he assembled, he destroyed, but kept the photographs. And the photographs is really where he applied the techniques that he had learned of shadowing, light, and arrangement. Next. On the left is a painting called Promenade. It features the flat style that he was developing, and these are cutout images, which again refers back to his tailoring background through his parents. And on the right is his first great masterpiece that was completed in New York, actually, right as they were moving, called Rope Dancer, Accompanying Herself with Shadows. And the story of this is that he saw a vaudeville show. He made sketches of various forms. He cut them out of colored paper, and he found that the pieces that fell on the ground were more interesting to him than the painting that he was attempting to create. So he changed, and he painted the scraps as they lay. He loved the abstraction, but he did put the tiny rope dancer at the top of the painting, This painting was exhibited later on in 1917, along with Duchamp in a historic show by the Society of Independent Artists, and it showed to great acclaim. Next. While he's still in New Jersey, he puts together a catalog of his paintings and submits them to the Danielle Gallery in New York. Danielle was somebody that was introduced to Man Ray. He loved the work, and he persuaded Man Ray, which didn't take a lot, to come and have his first exhibition in New York City. And this dance interpretation is one of 20 or so paintings that he brought in. He sold none of them. He returned to New Jersey despondent, and then got a phone call from Danielle that one of the people that were at the show from Chicago calls Danielle and says, "I want 6 of those paintings and I'll pay $2,000. Man Ray was ecstatic and immediately said to Donna, "We're moving to New York." And that was the end of New Jersey. New York City, next. So New York City, to the right is his self-portrait. He showed this in that same show in 1917, the Society of Independent Artists. And it was shown front and center in this show. And people kept trying to press the button at the bottom, which of course didn't work. And this was Man Ray making one of his first true marks, along with Duchamp, as a Dadaist, which featured first and foremost absurdity. Next. Duchamp here on the right met Man Ray first in New Jersey. He came out with a friend to meet this young man, Man Ray, who was 3 years younger than Duchamp. And at that time, that meant that Duchamp was 26 and he was 23. They instantly connected. So much so that that same afternoon, they decided to play tennis. Duchamp spoke no English, Man Ray no French. There was no tennis court, no rackets, no balls. But they played a tennis match. And again, something that they both thought was a great idea, if absurd. And it cemented what became the closest of friendships and collaboration and mutual stimulation, and right to the end of Duchamp's life. They also found out that they were both chess enthusiasts. And as we'll see, they played chess. Next to Man Ray is a poster of the New York Dada Group, 1921. This was advertising the first meeting. The woman in it is Catherine Dreyer, who was a modern artist and a patron, and became a significant patron of Duchamp, as well as Man Ray, but Duchamp more. And this was to be the beginning of this museum that she was creating, named by Man Ray, the Société Anonyme. But this was the one and only meeting of the museum, of which Duchamp was the president and Man Ray was the vice president, and it basically disappeared in the same year. But Dada did not. Next slide. Duchamp is featured sitting by his very famous urinal called the Fountain. And this caused an uproar in the art world. He submitted it to the same Society of Independent Artists, who prided themselves on accepting any work by a member of the society, except this one. And forced by an uproar among his colleagues, they showed it, but behind a partition. You literally had to walk behind a partition to see Duchamp's Fountain, and he named it with his pseudonym R. Mutt, 1917. Duchamp found it revolutionary to put a name or a title on an object that he might find in any ordinary place, hardware store, etc., anything in the normal realm. He called it a ready-made. And Man Ray was delighted to do the same, although Man Ray liked to do two things at once. So it was a ready-made plus. But again, the two of them were so connected in their perspective on their engagement with modern art. Next. And by the way, in that Society of Independent Artists, as I mentioned, Man Ray, in addition to his self-portrait, which caused the stir, had his rope dancer painting, which was very large and was extremely well received. So he was really launched in New York. Now, this is a series of pseudo-scientific abstractions. Man Ray loved sort of mechanical drawings, mathematical equations to the extent they could translate into forms. And he traced these forms on specimen colored paper, cut them out, pasted it on a white cardboard that he put on a revolving stand so it could be turned. And he put fanciful titles on each of these, and they're all large oil portraits on each of these, which was suggested by Stieglitz. And he submitted this to his second show at the Daniel Gallery. Next. Again, at the Daniel Gallery, he sold nothing but these were, but again, got reasonably good critical attention. And these are some of the things that were in that show. And what's noteworthy about these, the one on the left called Jazz, and in the middle called Danger Dancer, is that these were airbrush paintings. So he used a spray paint to paint these. And where precision was required, he laboriously used stenciling to get the precision he wanted. But because in New York, he was in such a cramped space, he didn't have room for his brushes and his canvases and his paints. He used a spray gun and a board and created these amazing paintings. And Danger Dancer called because when he put it up there, and this came from a mannequin where he removed the cloth and he found these gears underneath, and he turned it into his painting, and he couldn't read. It was written Danger or Dancer. It wasn't clear. So he called it Danger Dancer. And there on the right, he has put it in the window of their first floor apartment, or his first floor apartment. He's living now by himself, having divorced Donna. Next. These are more of the ready-mades that he did, and they're extraordinary. The one on the left is a lampshade that he unscrolled and loved the image and took pictures of it. And it is the first piece that Catherine Dreyer bought of his that she really kept her whole life. And this image continues to reappear in paintings over the course of his life. And we'll see one that he painted in 1952, where this is prominently part of the image. The second one, which he called Obstruction, he had all of these hangers that he arranged. He loved the arrangement. He loved the shadowing under it. And he loved the possibility of collapsing all of them, putting it in a valise and walking away. So much with a great artwork, as long as he had the photograph. And the last one is he took an egg beater. He called it Man. It somehow struck him as man. But then later on, he called the same image Woman. So could have been either one. But here he deploys lighting to create beauty from a mundane object, which is something he did his whole life. Next. These are two celebrated images that he did really in the last couple of months before he went to France. The one on the left, woman smoking a cigarette. The Dadaists of Paris used this for their the cover of their magazine. They flipped over it and they saw this upside down image of this woman with her hair on the bottom like a wheat field, they called it, and the smoldering cigarette erect from her lips, which they made sure to emphasize. Eros was always at the center of Dadaism and Surrealism, actually. The next image, called The Enigma of Isadore Duncan, is indeed enigmatic. Angela Isadore Duncan was a pioneer of modern dance. She died tragically at the height of her career when her scarf got caught in the wheel and axle of an open-air car. Her driver, who was also her mechanic, and probably more than that, said her last words were, "I am off to love." Gertrude Stein famously said about her that affections can be dangerous. What this image represents is more than is anyone's guess, but I think it represents the scarf in some way with the disappearance of Angela Isadore Duncan. Next. I love this image. This is Marcel Duchamp dressed as Rose Salave. He loved transformation. This is his new identity. Rose Salave, apparently in French, resembles Eros, that's life. And both he and Man Ray sort of concocted this. They thought it was great. He wasn't hiding out from anyone. He just loved the idea of movement and transformation. The bottle on the right features this image, and it says Eau de Violette, which is a play on words. I forget what it otherwise would have said, maybe Eau de Bain, but anyway, this was Marcel Duchamp and Man Ray having fun, and this really marked, and this was on the cover of their only New York Dada magazine, which then folded, and off they went to Paris. Next. This is a self-portrait of Man Ray in Paris, 1921. He's just arrived. The table is set for him in this portrait. He has his wooden chess pieces, and in the background, his monumental painting called Tapestry that he did in 1913, now lost. In Paris, he is welcomed with open arms, first by Duchamp, who guides him to the nearest cafe, surrounded by the Paris Dadaists, who welcome him, who are thrilled. His reputation has preceded him. Next. Here is that Dadaist group. Without identifying any of them, Man Ray is taking the picture. Again, he's the newcomer, but they love him. And there, one of them is holding his portrait up while he's taking the picture. And next, and on the right is Tristan Tzara, who is probably the most famous of the Paris Dadaists. He was the head of the group, and he's there with some of his strange objects as well. The Dadaists loved strange objects that were ordinary. Next. He goes out for a drink with Eric Satie, who's one of the Dadaists and a great composer. They visit a hardware store. Man Ray buys a flat iron, buys tacks and glue, And he, right then and there, glues the tacks onto the bottom of the flat iron and gives it as a gift to Sati. It's since been lost, but many replicas have been made of it. And it is exhibited by the Dadaists. They go crazy over this. This is a perfect emblem for Dadaism, as it described in a show they have, an assisted ready-made with bite. And it becomes one of the most iconic images of Dadaism. We have a really short video on this.
An object is a result of looking at something which in itself has no quality or charm. I pick something which in itself has no meaning at all. I disregard completely the aesthetic quality of the object. I'm against craftsmanship. I say the world is full of wonderful craftsmen, but there are very few practical dreamers. In the early days in Paris, when I first came over, and I passed by a hardware shop and I saw a flat iron in the window, I said, there's an object which is almost invisible. Maybe I could do something with that. What could I do? Is to add something in it that was provocative. So I got a box of tacks. I glued on a row of tacks to it to make it useless, as I thought. But nothing is really useless. You can always find a useless even for the most extravagant object.
Terrific. Okay, and that's the elder Man Ray reflecting on the gift, le cadeau. Next. On the left is Jean Cocteau, poet, film writer, theater playwright, and a close friend of Man Ray. And here Man Ray is doing a portrait of him, but Cocteau insisted that he be the portrait in the portrait, holding up a frame. Cocteau, and very soon after Man Ray is in Paris, calls on him and says, come with me quick. Marcel Proust has died. His brother's just called me. He wants a photograph, a death mask photograph of Proust. So they rush over, and Man Ray takes this photo, which again becomes iconic. He says it was the most challenging and disagreeable of assignments. And Proust had died that night of pulmonary abscess, which included pneumonia, but apparently spent his last night dictating changes to the 3,000-page Remembrance of Things Past. Next. Here's Man Ray and Duchamp, 1925. They're playing chess. Beneath them is the Luxembourg Gardens. This is a still from a movie that Man Ray made, and it's only about a minute or a half or 2 minutes, worth looking on YouTube, because 2/3 of the way into the movie, some type of gust of light springs up and sweeps all of them off somewhere. Perhaps in the garden, not clear, but that was the end of their chess match. But again, Duchamp was always debunking existing ideas about art, which he said should appeal not to the senses, but to the intellect, like chess. Next. This is Kiki de Montparnasse. She was the queen of Montparnasse. She was a cabaret performer, a model, an extraordinary personality within the art community that Man Ray found himself, and she became his first great love in Paris and model, and was the model for many of his most iconic photographs, as we're going to see. So next. Here's Kiki on the left. Apparently, as soon as Man Ray appeared in Paris, he was in a cafe. A friend said, "Oh, there's Kiki de Montparnasse. Would you like to meet her?" And he said, "Sure." And she and her friend came over and sat down. She left with Man Ray. They walked all around Montparnasse. She went home with him, and she was to stay with him for 6, sometimes tumultuous years through the end of 1928. And here is Kiki in 1928, really at the end of their relationship. But she was an extraordinary figure and a fantastic model for Man Ray, who felt that she had everything, her beauty and her personality made her a perfect model. Next. This is Kiki. This is Kiki's torso that Man Ray sort of doctored with his shadowing and light effects. And this was on the cover of the advertisement for one of his movies, Le Retour à la Raison, which is the return to reason. And there she is on the cover in all of her striped glory. Next. This next image is probably recognizable to everybody. Violin d'Angras, 1924. Man Ray took the great 19th century painter Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, who practiced the violin as a hobby. And Man Ray took Kiki, dressed her in a turban, got her turned profile, did cutouts of the f-stops in her body, which suggested a violin or a cello, and here became one of the great images of modern art. Kiki died, unfortunately, early, young. She was 51. At her gravestone, it says, "The Queen of Montparnasse." Next. This is another iconic image. Man Ray prized this more than all of his other photos, and it remains arguably the most iconic and enigmatic of all of his photographs. The mask is from the Ivory Coast. That's Kiki with her face down, eyes closed, hair slicked back. The elements of this, the contrast, the lighting, the shadowing, the composition, the photograph itself is the art. The object of the art disappears after the arrangement, but the photograph is forever. Next. Man Ray discovers during a photo shoot that he was doing for Poiret by accident that paper that was not exposed to the negative wound up in the chemical bath, and he was so annoyed of wasting the image that he placed various objects on the image, the negative or the paper in the bath, and turned on the light and found that the uncovered part of the paper turned black, and the distorted objects, the silhouettes, were grays and whites. And he called these rayographs, and he loved this, and he became famous for it, even though the technique actually was, he was not the first, but he certainly was the first to create a whole new art form called the rayograph. The rayograph in the picture here is called the L'Ange Ertebis, which is a poem by Cocteau. And when Cocteau saw the rayograph, he said that Man Ray had captured the unknowable angel. Next. These are images of rayographs that Man Ray did, and he did hundreds of these, and others were to do them as well. These again are ordinary objects arranged in a composition and treated to different shades of light and shadow that fascinated him. And he was to do these for all the years of his life. These were his rayographs. Next. So 1928, he breaks up with Kiki, and he is in Paris preparing to go to Biarritz, and he stops in a cafe, and who is in the cafe but this beautiful young Lee Miller. She has been sent from America to find Man Ray, to work with Man Ray, to learn from him. She herself was discovered in New York by none other than Condé Nast, who saved her from getting hit by a bus off a street corner, and was struck by her beauty, made her one of his models, and she was at age 19 on the cover of Vogue. But she wanted to be a photographer. She's told to find this guy, Man Ray, and she does. She stops in the bar thinking he's left, and the bartender says, no, 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 he's walking through the door. She goes up to him and she says, I'm Lee Miller, I'm your new assistant. He says, well, I don't have assistants. She says, now you do. He said, well, I'm going to Biarritz. She said, I'm coming with you. She went with him and stayed with him for the next 3 years and became his second greatest model, with many iconic images of her own. Next. These are images, and there's dozens of them that he took in these almost surreal photos called anatomies in 1930. And I chose these 3 interesting forms, including the last one on the right that looked kind of phallic, and I'm not the first to think that, but this, again, as I said, these surrealists, they were never far from their ideas about Eros. And Lee Miller was a model for him that, as I said, was responsible for any number of iconic images. Next. This is one that called La Prière, which is the prayer, which is his drawing, and then his photo of sort of the idea of a supplicant in reverse, I would say. Next. His relationship with Lee Miller is breaking up, and here is a photo image of her with glass tears called Larmes. Tears, 1931. Next, 1932. You probably know this image. It is L'heure de l'Observatoire, Les Amoureux, the Lovers, 1932. By the time he's finished this, and that is Lee Miller's lips, they've broken up. And he is absolutely in despair, which he doesn't recover from for years. But he keeps this image in his studio, in his cramped studio, with this above his couch so he can see it every day. And the next image, next, Jerry, is Man Ray on the left, on his couch, with his chessboard, and with the lovers above his head. And on the next image is, I'm not sure who that is, but any number of artists, models, people would come through and want to pose beneath the lovers. And by the way, that image is the cover of his autobiography called Self-Portrait, that he took 11 years from 1951 to 1963 writing, which we'll talk about later. But that image stayed with him, and the idea of Lee Miller never left him as well. Next. So they have broken up. He does this photo of Lee Miller upside down portrait, a bizarre portrait, again, one of the icons of surrealism. And the object next to it is called The Object to be Destroyed. It is a metronome, and whose eye is there in the metronome, reminding him with his back and forth Lee Miller's eyes, until the object to be destroyed is destroyed. And we're left with the photograph. Next. But over the years, she goes on to marry a Brit, Roland Penrose. They become friends again over the years. And this is a beautiful photo of Lee Miller and Man Ray in 1975, year before his death and her death, many years after their original relationship. Next. Now, Lee Miller was also responsible for discovering a technique that Man Ray developed to perfection called solarization. And this is a solarized portrait of Lee Miller in 1929. And I'm going to let the curator of the Museum of American Art of the University of Virginia explain the process. Next.
I'm Michael Taylor. I'm the Chief Curator and Deputy Director for Art and Education at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. And I'm here to talk about Man Ray the Parashiers. So one of the great highlights of the Man Ray the Parashiers exhibition is a gallery devoted to solarization. This was a method of portraiture that he applies to subjects like Mary Oppenheim, Georges Braque, and Max Ernst. And when you see those photographs, they look unlike any other portraits in the exhibition. So in order to take a deeper dive into this technique, we've invited Jeffrey Allison, our head of statewide programs, and himself, a serious photographer, to delve into this technique. How do you make a solarized portrait? Polarization is actually a photography technique originally called the Spatier effect that was discovered in the 1850s. But in 1929, Lee Miller, a wonderful model and photographer in her own right, was working as an assistant to Man Ray, making photographs in his darkroom. The story goes that a mouse ran across her foot, and she did the one thing you should never do in a darkroom. She flipped on the light, realized her mistake, and shut the light off immediately. That created a solarized print in which the original tonalities of the print are basically reversed, and it creates what could be described as an amazingly silver-based image. We're at the MFA studio darkroom, and we're going to experiment. So let's go into the darkroom and see what we can do.
Okay, Jerry, next. This is fascinating, but longer than we want to say, and very easy to find if anybody wants to see the whole video. That's the person that they solarize.
Try.
Can't do it?
We're going to look at that today.
Yep.
I'm
I'll
gonna turn around
figure
and go
it out
to the-
somehow.
Set it up. Photography technique.
It's just, there we go.
There you go. So these are, and sorry to deny those interested because it is fascinating, but he gave a really good explanation of what it is. Here is Tanya Ram, her solarized portrait in 1929. She was one of the great models for Man Ray and the best friend of Lee Miller. And here you can see on the left, the black outline that's characteristic of the solarized portrait with the silver, soft white gray image. Next to that is also Tanya Ram. This is from a movie that she did. She was one of Man Ray's frequent actors for his movie. And she's there with a heating element, which is superimposed on her portrait. Next. This is Merritt Oppenheim. Some of you might have seen her exhibition at MoMA. In the middle is her fur-lined teacup luncheon in fur that caused a sensation and was the first woman modernist artist acquired object for MoMA, was this one, luncheon in fur. There is Merit Solarized, 1932. Again, a classic Man Ray portrait. And there she is on the left, a still from a movie he did, Erotique Voilée. And she is naked behind this printing wheel and covered in black ink. Man Ray said about her, and she was also his lover off and on for 2 years. He said about her that she was the most uninhibited person I've ever met, which is saying a lot in the Paris of the 20s and 30s. And actually, it's the first work of a woman purchased by MoMA in their history. Next. Here are more solarized portraits. That's Max Ernst, who played a crucial role in both Dadaism as well as Surrealism, and a great innovator himself, especially taking rubbings on paper from more textured surfaces. And he was a very close friend of Man Ray. And later on, back in Los Angeles, he and his wife and Man Ray and his new wife, Juliette Bruner, get married. And we have a photo of that later on. That's Man Ray in the middle with a cello, solarized. And that is, again, one of his most famous images of George Braque, the great friend, collaborator, colleague, competitor with Picasso in one of the forerunners of Cubism. Next. This is an amazing portrait, the solarized portrait of Jean-Louis Barrault, who was a famous actor, producer, theater director. That's Man Ray's solarized portrait of him, and there he is on the right, very handsome guy, and iconic image. Next. And then for a female torso solarized, iconic, this is Eva Ravai, solarized nude. There she is in her studio. He talked, Man Ray said about solarization, I thought a great quote. He said it allowed him to get away from the banality of photography, a chance to produce photographs that did not look like photography, looked like art to him. Next. He did hundreds of portraits. Everybody in Paris wanted Man Ray to photograph them. Artists, fashion leaders, actors, everyone. His reputation spread so quickly that they were lined up, and it was in part to his chagrin. Commercially, it was wonderful, but reputationally, more and more, he became known as a portrait artist, a portrait photographer, which, you know, bothered him, again, to no end. This is the first portrait that he does, iconic. This is of Berenice Abbott, who becomes one of the great photographers herself, but she worked as Man Ray's assistant from 1923 to 26 before going out on her own, when she returns to New York and in time becomes extremely famous, rivaled only by Man Ray in her fame. Next. Here's a portrait that Man Ray did of Gertrude Stein that was in Vanity Fair. There she is in her apartment with her muse and lover, Alice B. Toklas. There, that's the shot of their apartment, and that's the cover of the book that many of us read, might have even been required reading, I don't recall, the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. And Gertrude Stein had Man Ray do all of her portraits for 5 years or so until he had the temerity to give her a bill of 500 francs. And in a rage, she not only declined to pay, but said she would never do never photograph again with Man Ray, and she never did. Next. This is one of many portraits Man Ray did of Picasso, kind of a imposing look. And next to him is his lover and muse and model and a great artist in her own right, underestimated for sure, Dora Maar, and her solarized portrait, which again becomes an iconic portrait of Man Ray's. Next. This is Hemingway, 1928, leading the charge of the lost post-World War I literary and artistic generation who found themselves in Paris. This portrait, he has a bandage on his forehead because just before the photo shoot with Man Ray, he goes to the bathroom and pulls the chain and thinking it's flushing the toilet. No, it was pulling down the casement window, which smacks him in the forehead. He goes out, Man Ray puts a bandage on him, gives him a hat, puts it on at a jaunty incline and takes the picture. And that becomes an iconic photo of Ernest Hemingway. Next to him is James Joyce. Sylvia Beach, who is the owner of the famed Shakespeare and Company in Paris, commissioned Man Ray to make this photo in connection with Joyce's publication, which she was the broke to the literary world, Ulysses, and this was the first cover. Next. This is Suzanne Duchamp, the younger sister of Marcel Duchamp, and a devoted surrealist and champion of her brother's work, but she was a terrific artist herself. This is a piece that she did in 1919 called Multiplication Brisée, which translates sort of to broken multiplication with these cascading words and letters. Next. Stravinsky, a famous portrait, was totally unplanned. This was in the middle of arranging shots. Stravinsky is maybe having some revelation or is thinking, when is this damn thing going to end? And Man Ray snaps the photo. What's not shown here is he has his legs crossed with his bare ankles. He didn't wear socks for this photo. Next to him is Nancy Cunard, English writer and patron. She was a patron of Sarah, Brancusi, Joyce, and she loved this with her arms covered in these West African ivory bracelets. This was a cover photo for Vogue. She sent this picture and sent all of her friends to Man Ray, thought he was the greatest because this was the greatest photograph. Next. This is Brancusi, Constantin Brancusi. This showcases the solarization, the softening of the robe or whatever jacket he's wearing. He revolutionized modern sculpture. His aesthetic was simplified form, reduction of details, certainly one of my favorite artists. And if you go to the Pompidou Center, it has his original studio full of his work, as I understand it, left as it was there outside the Pompidou Center. Next to him is Henri Matisse. What's interesting about this, and this was a cover photo, this was a photo for Vanity Fair, is that Man Ray for the shoot forgot his camera lens and he improvised using his glasses, which he taped to the opening of the camera, which accounts for a little bit of a softer image. Next. Salvador Dali with Man Ray, 1929. Man Ray did many images of Dali, But even in this image of the two of them, you get Salvador Dali with that hallucinatory look, those eyes, the Dali eyes. And certainly he was probably the greatest known artist of the international surrealist movement. Next to him is Giorgio de Chirico, Italian artist, surrealist. Again, one of my favorites with his abstract, surreal images of architecture that goes nowhere. And this is one of Man Ray's famous solarized portraits. Next. Here's Virginia Woolf. He took this photo of her. At the time, it became the cover portrait of Time magazine. At the time of this photo, her fame as the most influential avant-garde writer of her generation was rivaled only by James Joyce. Next. Another iconic photo by Man Ray. This was cover of Harper's Bazaar, Wallace Simpson. Man Ray said it was the most celebrated sitting of his career. He probably wasn't happy about it because it went against the grain of his sort of negative approach to those kind of things. But he took this picture, he took many pictures of her. This was at a time where she was involved in an extramarital affair with Edward, Prince of Wales, soon to become King Edward VIII. Her husband, from whom she divorced to marry Edward, made now King Edward VIII promise that he would be faithful and look after her. Of course, the reputation of both Wallace Simpson and King Edward VIII were trashed by their cozying up to the Nazis, including Hitler himself. Next. There's a picture of Paul Eluard, who was the great poet of the Surrealists, and his wife. Next to him, the top image is his wife, Noosh Eluard, and her closest friend, Sonia Moss, 1936. Sonia Moss, within several years, is captured by the Nazis. She was involved in opposition, sent to concentration camp, and murdered. And Noosh, 2 years later, dies of a massive stroke. She was the love of Paul's life. And next, and we'll see, this is a book that Eluard did. He wrote the poetry, Man Ray did the photographs, and photographing, again, completely washed, solarized portraits of Noosh. Next. And here is more of the same. Again, Man Ray, the genius with a camera, creating conceptual art. Next. Okay, surrealism. Dadaism basically expires around 1924, and many of the Dadaists become surrealists. And it's not, you know, the line is a fine one between them, but think of think of Dadaism as sort of focused on anarchic absurdity. They reveled in negation. Surrealism had more of a clearly defined philosophy, defined by that guy in the right, André Breton, that seemed to glorify the irrational impulse, dreams. He was very influenced by Freud and felt that that surrealism was achieving the freedom from societal constraints with the experience through dreams. And as the surrealists endeavored to create work that was informed, at least, by their dreams, by their free associations, This is Andre Breton, who writes the Surrealistic Manifesto in 1923. Next. This is another self-portrait by Man Ray in 1932. He doesn't look very happy here. In fact, it looks like a death mask in a coffin. Again, this is at the time where his breakup with Lee Miller is final, but an extraordinary portrait, self-portrait, utilizing all of his skills to feature his own despair, I think. Next to it is the surrealistic chessboard. It's 16 surrealists, all of the surrealists of Paris, 1934. There's Man Ray in the bottom corner with his solarized portrait. Next. This is pictures of a mannequin that Man Ray designed at sort of the apex of the surrealistic movement. Each of the 16 surrealists got a mannequin to do something with.
We'll talk later. Okay, bye.
Somebody should mute. And Man Ray's mannequin, he has glass tears in her eyes, glass bubbles in her hair. This was his submission to the Surrealist Mannequin Exhibition of 1938. Next. These next slides represent some of the paintings during this prodigious output of Man Ray's leading up to the last year, 1940, before he flees to America, flees the Nazis about to enter Paris. On the left is Le Beau Temps, again, classic Man Ray, but in it, you can see the mannequins, the cutouts, the scraps that harken back to his childhood days at the foot of his father and mother in their tailoring. Next to that is La Fortune, a classic surrealistic image. Looks like Magritte to me, but it's Man Ray's offering, and again, one of his well-known images. And then next. And these are the image on the left, the Marquis de Sade, bizarre image, again, in keeping with his surrealism in his artwork, just before he's about to go to America. The image on the right is actually painted when he is in LA, called Night Sun Abandoned Playground. And there's a little Di Carico in there with that building and the steps going up. Next. These two images, he's still right at the end of his Paris years, is a painting he did earlier for a movie called Le Retour à la Raison, The Return to Reason. And this is a painting he does in 1923 from that same original image. And you can see in it the lampshade that he sold to Catherine Dreyer in 1921 or 1920. Here it appears again in this painting that he does in 1939. Next to that is a painting called Self-Portrait with space writing, and you can sort of make out his shadowed figure behind the space writing, which he did apparently by drawing in air with a small pen light with a very long, prolonged exposure time. Next. Here is Adrienne Fidelin, otherwise known as Addie. She becomes his partner, his lover from 1936 to 1940 during this period of feverish work that we just looked at. There is a portrait that he does of Addie. She was a dancer and a model from Guadalupe. She was the first Black model to appear in a major fashion magazine, Harper's Bazaar, and that's Man Ray's portrait of her. Next. Here they are, Addie and Man Ray in the south of France. These two pictures, and he loved her and she loved him. But when he leaves for America in 1940, he resumes his own separate life, and she does as well, and gets married, and that's sort of the end of their relationship, which has lasted 4 years before he leaves. Next. Now he's in Los Angeles, 1940. He has left most of his work back in France, and he's terrified at what's going to happen to it, although Addie makes sure to take care of most of it, which she does successfully. Here he is doing a portrait of Ava Gardner for one of her upcoming films, Pandora and the Flying Dutchman, 1950. So he was in America also doing portraits, both photographic as well as painted portraits. Next. He never stopped his fascination with mechanical objects and drawings. Here is a drawing, and then here is the actual object which he has created. He calls it Mathematical Object, 1946. Next. And he has all sorts of other objects that he puts together. La Fortune, number 3, 1946, with its side view. He collected these objects. He had dozens of them. He called them objects of my affection. They were all shown, by the way, in 1963 in Milan with a big show of Man Ray's objects of my affection. Next. These mathematical objects, Man Ray was reimagining in full oil color paintings of black and white photos that he took of mathematical forms at the Art Institute Poincaré. He was exploring them because he thought that they all exhibited a surrealistic expression, and he took many pictures. He comes back in LA. He does paintings of all of them, and Breton suggests, looking at 20 of them, that he gives them some writerly title. Man Ray decides arbitrarily that he's going to call them Shakespearean equations and names each one of them after another Shakespeare play, this one being Twelfth Night. Next. That's Man Ray and Duchamp around the same time, 1948. And this is a video that talks about these Shakespearean equations. That photograph is of Anthony and Cleopatra. Next video.
This exhibition sets out to decode the puzzle of pioneering artist Man Ray's journey from mathematics to Shakespeare, exploring a little-known yet pivotal chapter in the artist's career. Charting a path from object to image, from photography to painting, from surrealist Paris to Golden Age Hollywood, Man Ray Human Equation reveals the inventive manner in which Man Ray moved across disciplines, challenging conventional boundaries between painting, object making, and photography. In Paris in the mid-1930s, where Man Ray was a leading participant in the surrealist group of artists and writers, he visited the Institut Henri Poincaré, a school of higher mathematics in Paris. There he discovered an extraordinary collection of three-dimensional mathematical models, which he was inspired to photograph. Forced by the advance of German troops to flee Paris in 1940, Man Ray returned to the United States and settled in Hollywood for the duration of the war. Among his most accomplished works from this decade he spent there are the series of paintings initially referred to as human equations. These were based on his mathematical photographs made several years earlier. His preliminary title of Human Equations revealed his intention to humanize the inanimate mathematical forms. He soon reconceptualized the project and transformed the mathematical models into characters in a series of theatrical tableaus, naming each painting after a specific Shakespearean play. The new title bestowed upon the series was Shakespearean Equations. Also featured in this exhibition are additional pieces by Man Ray, some well-known and others rarely seen, that link the Shakespearean equations with his wider practice. Framed within the art science matrix that characterized avant-garde artistic activities in the first half of the 20th century, Man Ray's work and his creative vision are cast in a new light.
Great. Thank you. Next. Immediately upon arriving in LA, Man Ray, always attracted to beautiful women, meets Juliet Browner. She's a model. She's 20 years younger than he is, and they are smitten with each other. And he will spend the rest of his life with Juliet. Next. They get married in a double wedding in 1946 with Max Ernst, one of his close buddies, and Dorothea Tanning, another artist, a very good artist. And that's Juliet on the wedding day, a beautiful portrait of her by Man Ray. Next. These are portraits, photographic portraits, stylized by Man Ray of Juliet between 1945 and 1950. Next. Here is Man Ray and Juliet in the 60s at home and on a motorcycle, and it's clear the love and the affection they have between them. And Juliet was not just adoring of Man Ray, but chronicled his later years and really worked to preserve his memory after he died in 1976. Next. Back in Paris in 1951, he goes back and rejoins Duchamp. In Paris in 1951, he feels a distinct lack of Paris in his life, in his art. He finds himself doing things over that he had done previously. He's worried about his artwork, reassured that it's all been preserved basically intact. And what does he do as soon as he gets to Paris? They get out their chessboard and they're playing chess, 1951. Next. Here's a painting that he does in 1952, Mon Premier Amour, My First Love. What's interesting about this is it's Man Ray's personal copy of the photo he took of the painting, on which he draws with a ballpoint pen the scribbled outlines that you see there. Couldn't help himself. Next. This is Man Ray's painting of the street that he lives on with Juliet, Rue Ferrou. And he says about this painting, he painted it as if he photographed it the same way, which is interesting because he still wants to be known first and foremost as a painter, which is his first love. The painting next to it, called Piscinema, 1959, is one of many examples. He did dozens of these in his later years in Paris of what he called natural paintings, where he would spread the colors according to the impulse of the moment, applying the paint with pressure from other surfaces and seeing what he got. Very surrealistic. He looked at this one, it was upside down. He turned it the other way, and lo and behold, he decided he saw a picture of him and Juliet. Next. In the 60s, he spends a lot of time with the objects of his affection, all of which are delightful and interesting. Again, using ready-mades. Here is a featherweight, he calls it. Next to it is an anti-vole, anti-flight, taking a common object, I'm not even sure what it is, and just creating another object that he loves. Next. Here he is in his studio with Juliet. It looks like she's in the kitchen, in the studio, and in the bedroom and living room all at the same time. He is at work with his book called Self-Portrait there next to him, which he finishes in 1963. And he says, in a life devoted to the graphic arts, I have felt more and more a desire to supplement my work with words. And sure enough, he comes up with plenty of words and pictures. Again, this is a book, I got it $6 on Google. The next image, next, is the cover of a film. I think the image is of a musical instrument that he had posed with earlier, and dice and cubes, and the film Iraq Baku. It's one of his famous films. I think that's what it was. But he did about 20 films between 1926 and 1940. Next, and I've listed them here with the year that he did it. This is one of the images of the film Imak Bakia. I misspoke. They're all short. They're all more or less interesting. I watched a good number of them, but all interesting. What a mind he had. Next. This is him in his studio in the 60s. And I have a video of his last words, but I'll just say that he took his last pictures out of the window of his studio. And when he died in 1976, and many were crying in the Montparnasse cemetery, Juliet says she was not. She raised her fist, and over his grave, she said, "Courage." In 1986, she had a memorial erected there. And I'm sorry, I don't have a picture, and it's online, and it's so interesting. It was a simple oval, much like the flat egg that he once painted. And on it is written a phrase that he used many times, quote, "unconcerned, but not indifferent," end quote. 5 years later, Juliet is buried next to him and adds next to Man Ray's gravestone, a separate one, smaller, with their pictures embedded and with the words "together again." Next. And this is the last words of Man Ray, which I'm sure you're going to enjoy.
What's Paris like when you arrived? For me, it was a new world. I didn't speak a word of French when I came here in 21. And I felt like a newborn baby after my struggles in America and rejections from the galleries and collective. From the very first day, Duchamp was already in Paris, and he took me around and he met everybody.
Looking back, I always have the feeling that the 20s and the 30s and the Surrealist movement, it was a great deal of fun.
No, not at the time. People just look back to it and think it's a marvelous period, romantic and all that stuff. But no, it was very tense. It was very bitter, and there was no humor in it. But what we did was really to upset things.
Were you ever conscious of creating art?
No. I never think about art, and I don't think the old masters ever thought that they were creating art. They had to express the spirit of their times.
You said once that fortunately there is no progress in art. What did you mean by that?
Well, the only thing my answer to that was, just as there is no progress in the manner of making love, there are only different ways of doing it. I cannot do anything better than the old masters did. My only justification is that I do something different. When they ask me, do you still like the old masters? I say, I think they're wonderful. But my only justification that I do something different. You ask the old masters what they think of my things, it may be much more interesting to hear their opinion.
Looking back at your life, what would you say satisfied you most?
Okay. Well, that concludes our visit with this extraordinary artist, Man Ray. I hope you enjoyed that, and happy to take any questions. Thank you. Are you all stupefied?
David, what were his last words? I couldn't catch that.
Well, no, I characterized that by just the video of the words. He had the last word on this presentation. His last words, I don't know, but yeah, I was very moved by Juliet and her memorial to him.
David, it was a fabulous presentation. I learned more about Man Ray today than I learned in all those years teaching. It was fabulous.
Thanks, Sharon.
Absolutely fabulous, as always.
Now, I must say that it's a treat for me to do these. I wouldn't say the same for Sharon,
Yes.
who says, "Oh no, another one," because a shout out to her. What a job she did putting all that together with captions, and she deserves at least the same acclaim that I might get. But
bravo to Sharon.
Yay, Sharon.
but
I want to thank both David and Sharon for this presentation. I had heard of Man Ray, of course, but knew very little about him. And now it was just very fascinating to learn all of this. I have one of my granddaughters is taking photography in school and loving it. And I'm anxious to show her this video of this presentation. I think she's really going to enjoy it as much as I did.
It's great. Thanks, Diane.
Thank you.
Thank you. Listen, I too knew relatively little about Man Ray other than the iconic, photos that we looked at, which everybody knows. But having looked at him, I met somebody that to the end of his life had this restless imagination, creativity, and commitment to doing something different. And so it's great for me to have that experience too. And for anybody that's interested, self-portrait, which I showed you, and Man Ray by Arthur LeBeau, which was done for the Yale series on Jewish personalities, which is really a nice general survey of his life. And this spectacular volume of Man Ray, the Paris Years, principally of his portraits. Man Ray would probably be chagrined that it doesn't have any of his artwork. It has just his portraits, but they are spectacular.
David, on behalf of Kehilat Hanahar, thank you so much for the series. You've done a number of them and they're on the website and there's more to come. I don't know whether you're willing to give a teaser as to your next
Yeah.
project.
Next one, I think, and many of you have probably heard of Louise Bourgeois, but I'm gonna try to get to know her and be able to present it at some time in the future. Sharon, don't have a heart attack.
Thanks, David, so much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Bye.
Bravo.
Have a great day, everybody.
Sharon.
Okay.